Hello everyone, I am Sarita V, Assistant Professor, Department of Basic Sciences and Humanities, Rajagiri School of Engineering and Technology. This presentation is specifically for Semester 4 BTech students of all engineering branches of APJ Abdul Kalam Technological University. Today, I will be discussing the topics in the first module of the subject Constitution of India. The contents of the discussion are definition of constitution and historical background of Indian constitution. The philosopher Aristotle in his work Politics analyzed over 150 Greek constitutions. He described a constitution as creating the frame upon which the government and laws of a society are built. Aristotle defines a constitution as the way of life the state has chosen for itself. The Constitution is a legal document having a special sanctity which sets out the framework and principal functions of the organs of the government of a state and declares the principles governing the operations of those organs. A constitution is a fundamental law, written or unwritten, that establishes the character of a government by defining the basic principles to which a society must conform. Perhaps the greatest achievement of India after the attainment of independence was framing of the constitution within a period of 3 years from December 1946 to November 1949. Framing of constitution was a stupendous and a challenging task considering the size, diversity and complex problem of India. Hence, let us examine the historical background of our constitution. Before 1947, India was divided into two main entities. The British India, which consisted of 11 provinces, and the princely states ruled by Indian princes under the subsidiary alliance policy. The British rule in India can be divided into two: the Company rule, which started from 1773 and ended in 1858, and the Crown rule, which started in 1858 and ended by 1947. The struggle for independence and framing a constitution for the country can be understood only if we look at the trajectory of Indian constitution. On 31st December 1600, Queen Elizabeth granted a charter to a company of London merchants to trade with the East Indies. The East India Company was initially created in 1600 to serve as a trading body for English merchants, specifically to participate in the East Indian spice trade. The Charter of 1600 delegated both legislative and judicial powers to the governor appointed by the English East Indian Company, including the power to administrate criminal law. As the English East Indian Company's territorial control expanded, new charters granted them powers of full territorial jurisdiction, including the powers to issue coinage, administer justice, and punish interlopers. The charter had only granted the company the jurisdiction over English subjects, but it soon found itself dealing with claims of Indians. The company eventually came to rule large areas of India, exercising military power and assuming administrative functions. Company rule in India effectively began in 1757 after the Battle of Plassey and lasted until 1858 when, following the Indian Rebellion of 1857, the Government of India Act of 1858 led to the British Crown assuming direct control of India in the form of New British Raj. The revolt of 1857 was an unsuccessful rebellion against the British rule in India. This was regarded as the first war of Indian independence. The mutiny led to the abolition of the East India Company and direct rule of British government, and also led to the beginning of the policy of consultation with Indians. In November 1858, Queen Victoria proclaimed Empress of India, and the Indian territories brought under direct control of the British government in London. The mutiny also forced new British rule to reorganize the army, the financial system, and the administration in India through passage of the Government of India Act of 1858. The act known as the Act of the Good Government of India abolished the East India Company and transferred the powers of the government territories and revenues to the British Crown. It provided that India henceforth was to be governed by and in the name of Her Majesty. It changed the designation of the Governor General of India to that of Viceroy of India. Viceroy was the direct representative of the British Crown in India. Lord Cannon thus became the first Viceroy of India. It created a new office, Secretary of the State for India, vested with complete authority and control over Indian administration. The Secretary of the State was a member of British Cabinet and was responsible ultimately to British Parliament. The Act of 1858 was, however, largely confined to the improvement of administrative machinery by which Indian government was to be supervised and controlled in England. It did not alter in any substantial way the system of government that prevailed in India. The defects of this highly centralized system of administration paved the way to an opposite process, that is, a process of decentralization as between the central and the provincial governments. The rapid growth of communications, the introduction and spread of English education, the assimilation of Western ideas of parliamentary government by Indians, and the consequent modernization of their outlook, all these might have been the contributory forces for the introduction of this new process of decentralization and the gradual change in the tone and character of the British Indian government. The process began with the passing of Indian Council Act in 1861, which for the first time introduced the principle of consultation in the Indian political scene by the British rulers. It was the first step through this Act of 1861 that Indians started associating with legislative works. The Act allowed Indians to take part in the lawmaking process as non-official members appointed by the Viceroy, and here the Viceroy had the final decision-making power. The decentralization process was initiated by restoring the legislative powers to Bombay and Madras presidencies, which, even though gave internal autonomy to the provinces, it was chiefly advisory and very much limited. New legislative councils for Bengal, northwestern provinces, and Punjab were established. It empowered the Viceroy not only to make rules and orders for more convenient transaction of business in the council, but also to issue ordinance without the concurrence of the Legislative Council during an emergency. The Indian Council Act of 1861 did not meet the Indian aspirations. After almost 24 years, the Indian Council Act of 1892 was passed, which was an amendment to rectify the shortcomings of the Indian Council Act of 1861. The Act increased the number of members in the Council, where the members were given the right to ask questions on budget, but they could not ask supplementary questions. The Legislative Council were empowered to make new laws and repeal old laws with the permission of the Governor General. Even though the Act of 1892 laid the foundation for the construction of parliamentary system in India, critics observe that the Act was a policy of British for gradually involving Indians in the British administrative structure with the object of preventing any major upsurge from the nationalist front by creating a permanent group of loyalists. The Act made a limited and indirect provision for the use of election in filling up some of the non-official seats both in central and the provincial legislative councils. The word election was, however, not used in the Act. The process was described as nominations made on the recommendation of certain bodies. The Act of 1892 basically laid the foundation for representative government, which was actually attempted by the Indian Council Act of 1909, or called as the Minto-Morley reforms. The Indian Council Act of 1909 brought into being limited electoral systems to elect some members to the provincial and central legislative councils. At that time, the Secretary of the State of India was Lord Morley and the Governor General of India was Lord Minto. The Act of 1909 implemented the reforms proposed by them. In the Act of 1909, the size of the council was enlarged and the number of non-official additional members was increased to 24, but the official majority continued. Their functions were widened. They could now criticize the actions of the executive, ask questions and even supplementary questions, and express their views by moving resolutions. It provided for the association of Indians with the Executive Council of the Viceroy and Governor. It recognized the principle of election, but elections were not by territorial constituencies. It was representation by classes and interests, corporate bodies and association, and all elections were indirect. As a result of this act, the Muslims could now have their own representative members at the legislative councils. They were to be elected by Muslims alone. The Indians were not satisfied with these reforms. The act provided freedom to have separate communal electorates, which sowed the seed of separatism in India that eventually led to the lamentable partition of the country. The idea of separate electorates for the Muslims was synchronous with the formation of the Muslim League as a political party in 1906. The unity of the nation was jeopardized. The reforms were not ultimately a step towards the goal of the parliament democracy. The commencement of the World War I resulted in a drastic change in the policy. The British needed India's cooperation in terms of men and money. On August 20, 1917, the British government declared for the first time that its objective was a gradual introduction of responsible government in India. This resulted in Montague-Chelmsford reforms. In consultation with the then Governor General Lord Chelmsford, he prepared the report on constitutional reforms, which became to be known as the Montfort Report. It became the basis of the Government of India Act of 1919. On the other hand, the Montfort Report was inadequate, unsatisfactory and disappointing. The Government of India Act of 1919 was then enacted, which came into force in 1921, which relaxed the central control over the provinces by demarcating and separating the central and provincial subjects. It divided the provincial subjects into two parts, transferred and reserved. The transferred subjects were to be administered by the governor with the aid of ministers responsible to legislative council. The reserved subjects, on the other hand, were to be administered by the governor and his executive council without being responsible to the legislative council. This dual scheme of governance was known as diarchy, and the term is derived from the Greek word diarch, which means double rule. It introduced for the first time bicameralism and direct elections in the country. Thus, the Indian Legislative Council was replaced by a bicameral legislative consisting of an upper house, that is Council of the State, and a lower house, which is known as Legislative Assembly. The majority of the members of both the houses were chosen by direct election. Some of the features of this act were: it required that the 3 of the 6 members of Viceroy Executive Councils were to be Indians. It extended the principle of communal representation by providing separate electorates for 6 Indian Christians, Anglo-Indians, and Europeans. It granted franchise to a limited number of people on the basis of property, tax, or education. It created a new office of the High Commissioner for India in London and transferred to him some of the functions hitherto performed by the Secretary of the State for India. It provided for the establishment of a Public Service Commission. Hence, a Central Public Service Commission was set up in 1926 for recruiting civil servants. It separated for the first time provincial subjects from the central subject, and authorized the provincial legislature to enact their budgets. It provided for the appointment of a statutory commission to inquire into and report on its working after 10 years of its coming into force. This act was also not satisfactory indeed. Even though the representation was extended, the Governor General's decision became the final verdict with respect to introduction of bills by Indian legislature. He could now make ordinances having force of the law for a temporary period in case of emergency. The Governor General and the governors had a lot of power to undermine the legislatures at the centre and the provinces respectively. Allocation of seats for central legislature was not on the basis of population but importance of the province in the eyes of the British. The Constitution of 1919 angered both the colonial officials in India and the Indian public. The reforms were followed almost immediately by the draconian Rowlatt Act, also known as the Anarchical and Revolutionary Crimes Act of 1919, which curbed the existing rights and remedies under the penal and criminal codes, limited the jurisdiction of courts, and sought to extend the powers of the executive to detain and try political prisoners. The Rowlatt Act led to popular unrest and the massacre of Jallianwala Bagh, further discrediting the reforms. The Hunter Committee, even though unanimously condemned General Dyer's action, did not impose any disciplinary action or penal action against him. The first elections held under the 1919 Act were officially boycotted by the Indian National Congress. By 1925, the national opinion was consolidated at a national convention which drafted the Commonwealth of India Bill. The draft with amendments was submitted to a subcommittee appointed by the All Parties Conference held at Delhi in January 1925 and which was presided over by Mahatma Gandhi. The finalized bill was ultimately introduced in the House of Commons in December 1925, titled as a bill to constitute within the British Empire a Commonwealth of India. The bill consisted of 127 articles organized around 10 chapters. It read like a full-fledged constitution and was comprehensive. It touched upon almost all themes that one would expect in a constitutional document. There was a section on fundamental rights, reminiscent of the Constitution of India Bill 1895, that included right to elementary education, freedom of expression, gender equality, non-discrimination, etc. Most of these rights, however, were subject to restrictions. Also, the bill put limits on franchise by prescribing qualifications that included income, land ownership, literacy, and education. The bill was presented in the British Parliament by Mr. George Lansbury, a leading member of the Labour Party, in December 1925. However, it did not go beyond the first reading stage as the Labour Party had been defeated in the elections. While the bill failed to pass through the British Parliament, it was very influential on constitutional antecedent documents that came after it. In 1927, the British government appointed the Simon Commission to review the working of the Government of India Act of 1919 and propose constitutional reforms for India. The commission did not have a single Indian member, which irked leaders of the nationalist movement. While the British acknowledged the discontent, it did not change the composition of the commission, and instead it asked Indians to prove that they could draw up a constitution themselves. On the other side, an all-parties conference met in 1928 and appointed a subcommittee under the chairmanship of Motilal Nehru to draft a constitution. This was the first major attempt by the Indians to draft a constitutional framework for the country. The committee included Tej Bahadur Sapru, Subhash Bose, M.S. Anne, Mangal Singh, Ali Imam, Shuab Qureshi, and J.R. Pradhan as its members. The report was finalized by August 1928. The recommendation of the Nehru Committee was unanimous except in one respect. While the majority favored the dominion status as a basis of constitution, a section of it wanted complete independence as a basis, with the majority section giving the latter section liberty of action. The major components of the Nehru report are the Bill of Rights, assigning equal rights to men and women as citizens, formation of federal form of government with residuary powers in the hands of the centre, proposal for the creation of Supreme Court, etc. The Congress in its annual session of 1928 did not accept this report since it suggested dominion status. The Muslim League also rejected it further. The report of the Simon Commission in 1929 was followed by the 3 Roundtable Conferences, where a variety of Indian leaders from British India and the princely states were invited to discuss constitutional reforms with British political leadership across parties. The Roundtable Conferences were a series of 3 conferences conducted by the Labour Party-led British government to deliberate upon and bring about constitutional reforms in British India during 1930 to 1932. There were 3 such conferences. The first Roundtable Conference was held between November 1930 and January 1931 in London. The second Roundtable Conference was held in London from 7 September 1931 to 1 December 1931 with the participation of Gandhi and the Indian National Congress. The third Roundtable Conference took place between 17 November 1932 and 24 December 1932. In between these events, the Puna Pact of 1932 plays a very crucial role. The Puna Pact of 1932 was an agreement between B.R. Ambedkar and M.K. Gandhi on the political representation of the depressed classes. A little more than a month earlier, Ramsay MacDonald, the British Prime Minister, announced the communal award that gave depressed classes separate electorate for central and provincial legislature. Gandhi viewed this as a danger to the Hindu community that would de-link untouchables from Hindus. Ambedkar and the other leaders of the depressed classes welcomed the award. On 20th September 1932, while in prison, Gandhi announced a fast unto death till the time separate electorates were removed from the award. Ambedkar later came around and agreed to negotiate. In the end, Gandhi and Ambedkar came to an agreement that is called as the Puna Pact of 1932 that discarded separate electorates for the untouchables. The recommendations of the Third Roundtable Conference were published in a white paper in 1933 and later discussed in the British Parliament. The recommendations were analysed and the Government of India Act of 1935 was passed on this basis. The Government of India Act was passed by the British Parliament in 1935 and came into effect in 1937. It was based on a report by a joint select committee led by Lord Linlithgow and set up the 2 houses of the British Parliament. The report in turn was a result of the joint committee's scrutiny of white paper, which was a scheme of constitutional proposals prepared by the British government as a result of the Roundtable Conferences. The Act marked a second milestone towards a completely responsible government in India. It was a lengthy and detailed document having 321 sections and 10 schedules. Let us discuss some of the features of the Government of India Act of 1935. The Act divided the powers between the centre and the units in terms of 3 lists: Federal List, Concurrent List and Provincial List. Residuary powers were given to the Viceroy. However, the Federation never came into being as the princely states did not join. It abolished diarchy in the provinces and introduced provincial autonomy in its place. It provided for the adoption of diarchy at the centre, which divided federal subjects into reserved as well as transferred subjects. It introduced bicameralism in 6 out of 11 provinces with many restrictions on them. It further extended the principle of communal representation by providing separate electorates for depressed classes, women and labour. It abolished the Council of India established by the Government of India Act of 1858. The Secretary of the State for India was provided with a team of advisors. It extended the franchise. About 10% of the total population got the voting right. It provided for the establishment of a Reserve Bank of India to control the currency and credit of the country. It provided for the establishment of not only a Federal Public Service Commission but also a Provincial Public Service Commission and Joint Public Service Commission for 2 or more provinces. It provided for the establishment of a Federal Court which was set up in 1937. The 1935 Act, which was based on the White Paper, failed to placate the Congress. The Congress declared that a constitution which curtails sovereignty of the people of India cannot be accepted, as it must be based on independence of India as a nation, and it can only be framed by a Constituent Assembly elected on adult franchise or franchise which approximates to it as nearly as possible. At the National Convention of Congress Legislators at Delhi on 19th and 20th March 1937, Jawaharlal Nehru, in his presidential address, declared that the Government of India Act 1935 must go lock, stock and barrel and leave the field open for our Constituent Assembly. Cripps mission was sent by the British government to India in March 1942 to obtain Indian cooperation for the British war efforts in the Second World War. It was headed by Sir Richard Stafford Cripps, a Labour minister in Winston Churchill's coalition government in Britain. Stafford Cripps made a proposal in the form of a draft declaration on 30th March 1942. In that declaration, India was promised dominion status with the power to secede from the British Commonwealth. For the first time, the British government acknowledged India's right to be a dominion. Indians could frame their own constitution now. The Cripps proposal were rejected by the Congress in the meeting on 11th April 1942, since they objected to the notion of separately forming a union since it damaged national unity. The Governor General's power being retained as against him, being only a constitutional head, was also difficult for them to accept, and also there was no concrete plan for the immediate transfer of power. The Special Commission of Cabinet Ministers, including Patrick Lawrence, the Secretary of State for India, Sir Stafford Cripps, President of the Board of Trade, and A.V. Alexander, First Lord of the Admiralty, landed in Karachi on March 23, 1945, mainly to explore the following objectives. That is, to create a machinery for Constitution of India, to make arrangements for an interim government. The Cabinet Mission Plan was like a declaration of India's independence. The important provisions laid down by the Cabinet Mission were to form a Union of India which had to be undivided, to form an interim government for India which had some of the features like it restricted communal representation and where all the members will be Indians, the interference of Viceroy will be limited, it will have a union and legislature with limited powers, provinces will be vested with all subjects except union subject and residuary powers, princely states would retain all subjects and all residuary powers, the British Indian provinces and the territories should be divided into three groups. The first group should contain Punjab, Northwest Frontier Province, Sindh and Balochistan. The second group should contain Bengal and Assam. The third group should contain the rest of the provinces. Now look at closely. These first two groups should contain the Muslim majority area and the third group the Hindu areas. And the three groups of provinces should also possess their separate constitution. Forming a Constituent Assembly based on a democratic principle with representatives from provincial assemblies and princely states. The Cabinet Mission thus upheld the unity of India and rejected the idea of independent Pakistan. The Congress and the Muslim League showed their disinterest in the area, the structure of the union and forming an interim government respectively. The Cabinet Mission plan thus did not succeed. On February 20th, 1947, the British Prime Minister Clement Attlee declared that the British rule in India would end by June 30th, 1948, after which the power would be transferred to responsible Indian hands. This announcement was followed by the agitation by Muslim League demanding the partition of the country. Again, on June 3, 1947, the British government made it clear that any constitution framed by the Constituent Assembly of India cannot apply to those parts of the country which were unwilling to accept it. On the same day, Lord Mountbatten, the Viceroy of India, put forth the partition plan known as the Mountbatten Plan. The plan was accepted by the Congress and Muslim League. Immediate effect was given to the plan by enacting the Indian Independence Act of 1947. The Indian Independence Act of 1947 received the royal assent and entered into force on 18 July 1947. This act put into action the Mountbatten Plan for the independence and partition of India. Let us look at some of the features of the Indian Independence Act of 1947. The two independent dominions, India and Pakistan, shall be set up on August 15, 1947. Each of the dominion would be headed by a Governor General. The territories comprising Sindh, Northwest Province, Baluchistan, West Punjab would constitute West Pakistan, and territories of Sylhet district and East Bengal would constitute East Pakistan. The Constituent Assembly of each dominion shall act as a provincial central legislature having full power to make laws for its dominion. The responsibility of the British government for the government of India would come to an end on 15 August 1947. The Governor General was to exercise full powers and authority for bringing the Indian Independence Act into operation. The British Parliament over the princely states would lapse on 15 August 1947, and each state would be free to join either the dominion or to declare itself as independent. Let us brief some of the important events that led to the framing of the Constitution of India. It was in 1934 that the idea of a Constituent Assembly for India was put forward by the first time by M.N. Roy, a pioneer of communist movement in India. The Constituent Assembly was constituted in November 1946 under the scheme formulated by the Cabinet Mission Plan. The Constituent Assembly held its first meeting on December 9, 1946. After the acceptance of the Mountbatten Plan of June 3, 1947, the representatives of most of the other princely states took their seats in the Assembly. Dr. B.R. Ambedkar introduced the final draft of the Constitution in the Assembly on November 4, 1948. On January 24, 1950, the Constituent Assembly held its final session. It, however, did not end and continued as the Provincial Parliament of India from January 26, 1950 till the formation of the new Parliament after the first general elections in 1951 to 52. The Constituent Assembly, which had been elected for undivided India and held its first sitting on 9th December 1946, resembled on 14th August 1947 as a sovereign Constituent Assembly for the Dominion of India. The important committees of the Constituent Assembly were the Union Powers Committee, the Committee on Fundamental Rights and Minorities, the Steering Committee, the Provincial Constitution Committee, and the Committee on Union Constitution. The draft was prepared by Sri B. N. Rao, advisor to the Constituent Assembly. A 7-member committee chaired by Sri Aladi Krishnaswamy Iyer was set up to examine the draft. Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, who was Minister of Law from 15th August 1947 to 26 January 1950, piloted the draft constitution in the Assembly. On 26 January 1950, the Indian Constitution came into effect. By this act, the Dominion of India transformed itself into Republic of India. The Constitution had been drafted, discussed and finalized by the Constituent Assembly between December 1946 and December 1949. Comprising 395 articles and 8 schedules, this lengthy document set out the architecture of the new state. The deliberations of the Constituent Assembly were comparably long and painstaking. They provided a fascinating window into the range of ideas and institutions that the makers of the Constitution envisioned for the new India. By these debates and the resultant Constitution also reflected the wider context in which the Constituent Assembly met and functions. In the next session, we will be discussing in detail the making of the Indian Constitution. Thank you.